On today's Tri-Lakes Performance DIY, we're doing a work from home episode. It's a beautiful day. I have a car that is misfiring a little bit. This is the Tri-Lakes Mopar, the 65 Newport that we're working on today. I'm in between projects here at the house. I have some meetings coming up. I have some deadlines. So today we're working in the driveway. Now, what we have for the episode is we're going to be taking off the existing ignition system. So this car is all original, which that sounds magical. It's cool to see the time capsule, but we drive our cars often. So the problem that I'm running into with this early ignition system, it still has breaker points, which I'll explain what that is a little bit later in the episode. The spark plug wires are very old. The spark plugs, I don't know when the last time they were changed, but it looks like it's been a while. So some of the problems that we're having with this is it's starting to misfire. That's an issue. Misfires mean no burnouts. No burnouts means sad face, can't have the fun that we want. So what we're going to start embarking on today is what we call stage 0. Everybody talks about making their car fast as hell. We can go out, we can go really quick, burn tires, all the fun things. And that's cool. Everybody loves burning tires. Stage 0 is often forgotten, but it includes your spark plug wires, your plugs, your distributor, your belts, your hoses, your fuel filters, all the things, the cooling system, things that actually make the car run reliably. So while it's super fun to go out and race people, it's also super sucky to break down and be that guy. So stage 0 allows us to both drive to where we're going, have a good time, fingers crossed, gets us back home. So today we're going to embark on the first stage of our stage 0 for the Newport, and that will be converting the ignition system from factory breaker points to a new Mopar Performance electronic ignition system. Here is the under hood condition of our 65 Newport, and it is in remarkably excellent shape. But we could see these old crusty ignition system components. There is our old distributor right there. Get a great look at it. So first stage we're going to do is take off the air cleaner, and then we're going to determine where cylinder 1 is, and then we're going to begin removing the old ignition components. Now, determining which cylinder on a V8 engine is number 1 is pretty straightforward. On a V8 engine, you'll notice, and we are here on the passenger side of the car looking across the fender. Now, if you pay attention to the front of the cylinder head, which on the passenger side is here, and if you look across on the other side, you will notice that the driver's side cylinder head is further forward on the engine than the passenger side. On a V8 engine, the cylinder that is the furthest forward marks cylinder number 1. So we are going to start at that. So the first thing that we need to determine, and what we need to do, is put cylinder number 1 up on the compression stroke. So with an internal combustion engine, we have the 4 cycles of combustion, which is suck, squeeze, bang, and blow. It's the intake, the compression, the power, and the exhaust stroke. So with the ignition system, the spark occurs ideally slightly before top dead center. Now, when I know where the compression stroke is on cylinder 1, then using the firing order of the engine, we can route the spark plug wires in the way that they need to go on the new distributor, and we can take everything off and begin replacing the components. Our next step up is to put number 1 cylinder up on the compression stroke. Now, we've determined that number 1 cylinder is the cylinder bank that is the furthest far forward, which is this cylinder right here. The reason we want to place the cylinder 1 on the compression stroke is because with an internal combustion engine, you have several stages of operation. You have 4 stages of combustion, which is the intake stroke, power stroke, compression stroke, and then the exhaust stroke. The ignition system throws a spark to the cylinder a few degrees before the compression stroke is finished. So as the piston is moving up and compressing the air, we shoot a spark while the piston is moving up. That ignites the air-fuel mixture. Now, when I place number 1 cylinder on the compression stroke, using the firing order of the engine, then I'll know how to route my wires amongst the distributor, and I can remove all of the old distributor components and spark plugs, and I can begin replacing those components with our new stuff. So the first thing that we need to do is place this engine on top dead center on the compression stroke. Now, to do that, in this particular case, I am going to jump the solenoid. Now, when we jump the solenoid on these, that activates the starter. The ignition system has been unplugged, so the engine is not going to start, but I do need to turn the engine over. Now, another thing that I've done is remove a spark plug from cylinder number 1. When I remove the spark plug, I place my finger over the spark plug hole in the head as I bump over the starter. Now, we'll feel 2 pulses on this. As the intake stroke begins, we'll actually feel a little bit of a suction on the plug, and as it comes up on its compression stroke, we'll feel it push our finger. So let's go ahead and find that out. And there we have it. We are up on the compression stroke for cylinder number 1. Okay, so we have removed the cylinder number 1 spark plug, and we have identified the wire for cylinder number 1, which is right here. Now, what we've done is I've removed the spark plug wire from its mounting brackets, and we have traced this back to the distributor. So we're pulling this out, and we have identified where on the distributor cap it falls. This is actually the number 1 wire right here. And we see it points to this location. And if we look, we can absolutely see that where number 1 spark plug wire is shooting, we timed it right by putting the engine up on the compression stroke. The rotor of the distributor is pointing directly to cylinder number 1. So when we replace the distributor, we will also have the new rotor pointing to cylinder number 1. We will mark this location on the cap, and then with the firing order, we will put the rest of the plug wires on and fire this thing up. So a tech tip, we love Sharpie markers here at the DIY Garage, and the reason why is it allows us to mark and make reference to things that we take apart so we get them back together the right way, because it's impossible to know everything about every car, and to be fair, we have squirrel brain, so it's really difficult for us to get everything in the same place. Now what we're going to do, and this will help us upon reassembly, we've already identified which spark plug wire goes to cylinder number 1. So on the distributor cap, all I'm going to do on the old one is mark a 1. This it will be our starting point when we replace the distributor cap. Now when we're replacing components, one thing that we always want to check is that our new components, or the components we are trying to replace our old ones with, are an exact match. And it's easier to do this before we try to install them. So to alleviate frustration, I have our brand new cap and rotor here from Mopar Performance, and we are comparing it with our old unit. And we can see not only is there a very stark difference inside, we can see in here the old terminals are corroded, they're a little bit worn, not the worst that I've seen, but still in need of some replacement. And we have our new shiny brass terminals, which kind of gives you a feel of where we're at. We have also verified that these two are exactly the same. We have our reference marks where the distributor cap indexes on the distributor itself. Every cap will have some sort of indexing feature. They will all be a little bit different, but they all have it, and that ensures we put the distributor cap back on the distributor in its proper place. So pay close attention to that. These two marks are exactly the same. These two distributor caps are exactly the same. As you will notice, from this hold down point, we've marked our number 1. So before we even begin, we have the same hold down point. on our new distributor, and I am going to go ahead, we're going to mark a number 1, and that will tell us where we start with our new spark plug wires. In addition to marking the distributor cap, we are going to note where the rotor is pointed on in relation to the engine or components that we will not be moving or changing. This gives us another reference point. So when we take out this old distributor and put our new one in its place, this will allow us to ensure everything is right. So what I'm going to do is just make an index mark where the pointer is, and that will get us right where we want to be. All right, we are now going to remove the rest of the spark plug wires and the spark plugs. All right, let's remove the other bank of spark plug wires and spark plugs. Now we have all the spark plugs out of the engine. We have all the spark plug wires removed. We have noted where cylinder number 1 is in the firing order, and we have also placed cylinder number 1 up on the compression stroke. So what we're going to do now is remove the old distributor. We're going to compare it to our replacement unit to make sure everything matches. Now, as a tech tip when working on these old vehicles, these cars were invented and put on the road before metric was even a thing in modern vehicles. So there are no metric bolts on this car. It is all American standard, which is your typical 1/2 inch, 9/16, 5/8, your typical standard inch sizes of wrenches. Now, in some cases, a metric wrench will work to remove a standard bolt. However, we always want to be aware and make sure that the wrenches that we use or the tools that we use to remove the fastener is in the proper tool. And what this will do is prevent any damage to the fastener and a whole lot of frustration if we strip out a head and or slip off and bust our knuckles. All right, let's go ahead and get the distributor out of here. Last thing that we want to do is remove the ground connection of the coil from the coil itself. Now, on an ignition system, especially on a breaker point, but traditionally in any ignition system that we encounter, the coil is supplied battery positive or 12 volt positive whenever the key is turned on. The ground side of the circuit is actually switched on and off by either, in this case, the breaker points, which I'll describe in a moment, or by the electronic ignition module. So we're going to go ahead and remove that. We're going to go ahead and pull the distributor from the engine. Always want to make sure you get the gasket removed. Do not allow any crusties or nasty things to fall down into our engine. All right, so what we have here is our old distributor. This is a breaker points type distributor. Points may be a terminology that you've heard if you've been around hot rodding at all. You're familiar with the term points, but I wanted to take a quick minute to actually talk about what these are. Breaker points are actually a mechanical switch, and we can actually see right here the switch contacts. And we have a lobe, a cam, on the distributor. Each one of those cam lobes correlates to a cylinder of the engine. Now, as each time this rotates, the switch opens and closes. Okay? So the ignition system, when the switch is closed, the ignition coil is turned on. The ignition coil operates by way of a magnetic field and a principle called induction. So when magnetism passes through a wire, induction occurs and voltage is induced. So essentially all an induction coil is a spiral of wires. So when this is closed, the electromagnetic field inside the coil is turned on, generating a strong field. As soon as we open this switch right there, the magnetic field collapses. That magnetic field then crosses through the wires of the ignition side of the coil, the secondary side of the coil, and that generates our spark. Thank Electude for our tech tip of the day. Now what we have here is a modern coil on plug ignition coil. However, the function is the same fundamentally between the ignition coil you find on older vehicles and modern vehicles. What we have here, we can see the spark plug. This portion would be replaced by the spark plug wires, and then we have an inner and outer coil. Now with the ignition system, and the coil in particular, spark occurs when the coil is turned off. So when the breaker points are closed, we build a magnetic field. In the outer portion of the coil, this is the primary side of the ignition coil, and this is what 12 volts runs through. So when the points are closed, 12 volts flows through that field, and it makes a magnetic field, as we can see here. Now, as soon as the breaker points open, that field collapses, and when it does, that magnetic field cuts through these smaller windings in this secondary ignition coil. That generates a very high voltage and produces a spark. So the way ignition coils step up the voltage from 12 volts to the 10,000 plus required for a spark, there are hundreds of windings here on the outside. There are thousands of windings here in the secondary. When you go from a smaller coil, winding of coils, to a larger number of coils, the larger the number of wires that the field passes through, the higher the voltage that you have. Okay, here we have our two distributors. They are side by side. I have the original Mopar unit here, and then I have the new Mopar Performance replacement. The shaft length is identical. This distributor body shape is identical, and we have also verified on the old distributor it had a gasket to prevent oil seepage. On this new distributor, there is an integrated O-ring. This will go a lot farther to controlling any oil leakage from the distributor location. All right, before we want to attempt to reinstall anything, we have a lot of grease and oil buildup and seepage and nastiness that has occurred just over the course of time. So we are going to, you'll notice I have put a rag down into the hole that leads into the engine to prohibit any of that from getting down in any of the filth. And we have some trusty brake cleaner, and we're just going to clean up this area. So here we have our new distributor, and we notice, as we talked about earlier, we have an O-ring on this particular unit that seals this up. Now what we want to do with any O-ring is we want to just dip our finger in a little bit of motor oil, clean, new motor oil, and we want to lubricate that O-ring before we put it in. Now, oil on an O-ring will not cause it to leak, but will allow us to seat the O-ring properly without cutting it, and it will prevent actually oil leaks for us in the future. All right, let's go ahead and set our distributor into the engine. Now I've cleaned up our distributor clamp a little bit, our clamp, and removed some of the grease and debris. Now what we're going to do is just set this on here and snug it. I don't want to tighten the distributor yet because we are going to need to rotate it in order to set engine timing at the end of the service. So for here, I'm just going to lightly snug it down, and that's just going to stop the distributor from flopping around on us while we finish the job. All right, we have verified that our replacement spark plugs are proper for our application. Now one thing we never want to do is simply install spark plugs right from the pack into our engine, especially on these older cars. Which is very important is the spark plug gap that occurs between the ground electrode and then the positive electrode here on the plug. This gap determines the spark duration and how much energy or how hard the ignition coil has to work to throw a spark. A smaller gap means less energy is required to initially jump the gap. That gives us a longer burn. If the gap is too large, that means the coil burns up all its energy just to jump the gap, which results in a very short spark and an incomplete burn. So checking spark plug gap is critical. We're going to do that now. All right, now we're going to check the gap on our spark plugs. We have our feeler gauge that is set to the specification for this particular application, which is 35 thousandths of an inch. So what we do is we just check the gauge at the gap here. All right, that one's fine. We're going to check the remaining 7. Now we're going to install the spark plugs back into the engine. All right, all the spark plugs have been installed in the engine. We torqued them down. Now we're going to set our distributor cap, and we're going to begin putting the spark plug wires on. Now, as you'll remember earlier in the video, we actually put number 1 cylinder on the compression stroke, and we marked number 1 terminal on the distributor before we took everything apart. We've done the same for our new one. What this has allowed us to do is, now that we know where number 1 is, getting ready to fire, on Mopar big blocks, the firing or the distributor actually rotates in a counterclockwise motion. So knowing where number 1 is, we can just continue to put each plug wire in its proper place according to the firing order. On a Mopar big block, 2 banks are even. So on bank that has number 1 cylinder, it goes 1, 3, 5, 7. The bank on the other side is 2, 4, 6, 8. And the firing order on the big block, as we've referred to our service information, is 1, 8, 4, 3, 6, 5, 7, 2. So starting with number 1, we'll go to number 8. We'll route the wires, get everything to where it will not touch the exhaust, get all the wires clipped up really nice in the factory locations, clean things up, and we'll go on to the next stage. Now, spark plug wire routing is very important to us. We do not want our wires to rub. We don't want them to get out of place. And we also do not want them all over the place. When we open the hood, I like things to look really neat and tidy. Now, there's a couple different ways we can accomplish that. We could purchase spark plug wire routing kits. You know, sometimes they work, they're generic, they're kind of expensive. And what works just as nice is this method with the zip tie. Now, I'm not just going to bundle them together. So what we're going to do is I'm going to loosely put 1 zip tie around my strand of 4. Now, in between each wire and around the zip tie, I am actually going to put additional zip ties to route and keep a hold of the wires. There's 1. Here's 2. And here is our 3rd. And And now what we want to do, we want to tighten up our cross ties first. Make sure the tails point down so you don't see them. It goes out of the way, so we'll tighten up one. Tighten up our second one. Tighten up the third one. And then last of all, we'll tighten the strap around. And then what we have is when everything is down, tight and snug, we have perfectly held spark plug wires that are spaced evenly and out of the way. All right, so for this installation, we have actually changed over from the manual ignition system to an electronic ignition system, and with that, we have a new ECU, or an electronic control unit, that will be in charge of controlling the spark. So what we've done is we have a wire that routes to the distributor and it plugs in. This is what connects to the pickup, and we have an ECU, and then we have another wire that we have to run over and hook up to our ballast resistor. So we will do that here in a moment. Okay, the ECU has been mounted. Now we have to reconnect the hookup for the coil. So as you'll remember, we cut off and removed the old distributor, and the distributor actually grounded the coil. So this new electronic ignition unit does the same job of the breaker points, and that is grounding or turning the coil on and off by switching the ground. So what we're going to do now is we are going to strip back the wire for the electronic wiring harness. And I am going to put our heat shrink. We're going to go ahead and put our connector on and connect this up. Okay, so we have hooked up our ground connection from the electronic ignition to the distributor. We've also hooked up the negative side of the ignition coil that is now controlled by our new electronic ignition control module. We've mounted the ECU on the firewall for the ignition system, routed all the wires to avoid exhaust and any sharp edges. Now we're going to move to the power side of the circuit. Now in this particular vehicle, we have a ballast resistor in series with the ignition coil that is located down this way. What the ballast resistor does is at idle, when there's less need for a hot spark, the vehicle's running at low load, it lowers the voltage provided to the ignition coil, and what that does is it stops the coil from overheating. So now we're going to hook up the other side, which is the positive side of the system, to the ballast resistor. We're going to remove the old ballast resistor and install our new unit. Okay, we have hooked up our ignition system. We're going to reconnect the negative battery terminal now, and we're going to give it a test fire. If all is right, we should light right off. Very, very happy with how this has gone down. What we're going to do now is finally set the ignition timing, and then I'll let you guys go. I want to thank our sponsors, SP Tools, QA1 Suspension, Atlantic British, and of course, Electude. Check out our YouTube channel, Tri-Lakes Performance DIY. Check out our Instagram at Tri-Lakes Performance. Subscribe. We got a lot more cool things coming up. Thanks for taking time to watch our stuff. Hope you learned something.